When Earth's warriors entered battle, they crushed all foes instantly. The missile hit before the alarm finished sounding. Owen Drake had his hands on the controls before the smoke cleared, pulling the Galloway hard to port as 3 more Volkai pulse rounds cut through the space where the ship had been half a second ago. The crew did not scream. They did not freeze. They moved, every one of them, with the kind of calm that only comes from training so deep it lives in the bones. "Return fire," Owen said, not shouted, said. The Galloway's rail cannons answered before the words were done. Commander Zeth of the Volkai 7th Fleet watched the data feed from his command platform and felt something unfamiliar move through his chest. The humans had not retreated. The Volkai had opened with a full salvo, the kind of opening that made every other species in the known galaxy immediately broadcast surrender signals. The humans had returned fire. Not only that, they had returned fire accurately. One of his escort vessels, the Strength of Korath, was already venting atmosphere from a clean penetration hit on its port side. The humans had found the gap in the hull plating on their second shot. The second shot. Zeth had fought 17 species across 30 years of expansion campaigns. None of them had scored a hit on a Volkai escort vessel in an opening exchange. Not once. "Fleet analysis," he said to his tactical officer. "How many Earth vessels are engaging?" "1, Commander." Zeth turned his large pale eyes toward the screen. 1 ship, smaller than his escorts by a factor of 3, returning fire with the confidence of a fleet. Owen Drake had no illusions about the math. The Volkai fleet numbered 43 ships. The Galloway was 1. But the Galloway was between those 43 ships and the inner solar system, and that was exactly where Owen intended to stay until the rest of Earth's response force arrived. "Clara," he said to his tactical officer, Lieutenant Clara West, "give me targeting solutions on their lead destroyer." "Already running," she said. Her voice was flat and focused. "They're cycling their shields. There's a half-second window every time they redirect power to the bow guns." "How long can you track the cycle?" "As long as you need me to." That was all Owen needed to hear. The Galloway cut hard across the nose of the Volkai formation, close enough that Zeth's own gunners hesitated, afraid of hitting their own vessels. Owen used that hesitation like a door. He pushed the Galloway through the gap, fired at point-blank range into the flank of the lead destroyer, and came back out the other side before the Volkai formation could turn its guns to track him. 3 hits, 2 confirmed penetrations. The lead destroyer began to slow. On the Volkai command ship, a young tactical officer turned to Zeth with an expression that Zeth had never seen on a subordinate's face before. It was the expression of someone who does not understand what they are looking at. "Commander," the officer said, "their pilot is using our own fleet spacing against us. He is threading between our ships intentionally." Zeth already knew. He was doing the same calculation his officer was doing and arriving at the same answer. The human vessel was not trying to destroy the fleet. It was trying to slow them. It was buying time. "For what?" "Long-range sensors," Zeth said. "What is moving in from the inner system?" The answer came back in 12 seconds. 14 Earth vessels. Moving at speeds the sensor officer had to check twice because the first reading seemed wrong. They were not moving like ships rushing to a battle. They were moving like missiles. Owen Drake received the confirmation signal from Fleet Command and allowed himself exactly 1 second of satisfaction. "Admiral Holt's group is 18 minutes out," Clara said. "Tell them they're not needed," Owen said. Clara looked at him. "I'm kidding," he said. "Tell them we've softened the front for them." Clara almost smiled. Almost. She was already back in the targeting display, tracking the shield cycle, calling out windows, her voice steady as a metronome while the space outside the viewport turned white with weapons fire. The Volkai did not understand what was happening to them. They had arrived at the edge of the human solar system with the expectation of a short, uncomplicated campaign. Every intelligence report they had gathered described humans as a young species, barely spacefaring, with no experience of interstellar warfare. The reports were accurate about one thing: humans were young. They were not, in any sense of the word, inexperienced. Every human crew member on the Galloway had more combat flight hours than the top pilots in the Volkai fleet, not because humans were gifted, because humans had spent 10,000 years finding reasons to fight each other, and when they ran out of reasons they invented new ones, and when there was nothing left to fight they trained, they competed, they pushed their bodies and their machines to the edge of what was possible and then pushed a little further, because that was what humans did when there was nothing else to occupy them. The Volkai had arrived expecting a primitive species. They had found a species that had been preparing for exactly this moment, without even knowing it. Owen put the Galloway into a spiraling climb above the Volkai formation, drew the fire of 6 ships simultaneously, and used the angle to confirm targeting data for Admiral Holt's incoming fleet. The Volkai had 18 minutes. They would need more than that. The Volkai had made one mistake beyond all the others. They had sent landing parties. Danny Cole found out about the landing parties the same way he found out about most things: too fast and too close. The first Volkai scout dropped through the canopy of trees 3 meters to his left and landed in a crouch, its sensor array swiveling toward him, and Danny was already moving before the thing had finished landing. He went low, left shoulder, left knee, controlled fall into the undergrowth, pulling Private Nina Cross down with him by the collar of her vest. "Contact," he whispered into the squad channel. 12 o'clock, 3 meters, single scout. Hold. 8 soldiers went still in the forest outside Reykjavik. The Volkai scout stood in the clearing, its sensor array turning slow circles, feeding data upward to whatever was hovering beyond the cloud layer. It had not seen them. It had not seen them because Danny had spent the last 4 hours positioning his squad in the mud, under thermal cover, in the gap between the scout's 2 primary sensor bands. He had spent 4 hours doing this because he had studied every piece of Volkai sensor data that Earth's analysts had assembled in the 72 hours since first contact, and he had found the gap, and he had built his entire defensive position around it. That was how Danny Cole operated. Before the shooting started, he thought. He thought harder and longer than most people were comfortable with. His commanding officers had spent years trying to get him to talk more in briefings because the silence worried them, because they mistook the silence for emptiness. It was not emptiness, it was calculation. The scout turned. It was going to walk directly through the squad's position. Danny tapped Nina on the shoulder. 2 fingers pointed left. She moved without sound, angling wide, and 3 other soldiers followed her arc on instinct. Danny took the right side with the remaining 4, spreading the squad into a loose crescent around the scout's path. The scout walked forward, stopped. Its sensor array made 1 full rotation. Danny brought it down with a single shot at the base of the sensor column. The only gap in the scout's field armor. A gap so small that Volkai intelligence analysts had classified it as practically untargetable in combat conditions. Danny had been targeting it for 40 minutes. Nina was already moving to secure the fallen scout and strip its communications relay before it could broadcast a distress signal. She had the relay pulled and dead in 11 seconds. She had practiced it in the dark, blindfolded, the night before, after the first intelligence reports described the relay's design. 11 seconds was 3 seconds slower than her personal best. She would practice again tonight. "Clear," she said, moving to secondary position. Danny looked up through the tree canopy at the clouds above Reykjavik, where 17 Volkai landing craft were burning through the atmosphere, each carrying 40 soldiers of a species that had never lost a ground campaign in recorded history. He spat on the ground. "Let's go meet them," he said. The Volcae landing force commander was named Oreth, and Oreth was not afraid of anything. He had pacified 11 worlds. He had walked through cities that burned on both sides of him and kept walking. He had a scar that ran from his left shoulder to his hip that he had earned on the 6th world, and kept as a reminder that even easy campaigns required attention. He stepped off the landing craft onto the black soil of Iceland, and immediately noticed that something was wrong. It was quiet. Not the quiet of a surrendered population, not the quiet of fear, a different kind of quiet, the kind of quiet that has intention behind it. He had time to recognize this before Danny Cole's squad opened up from 4 directions simultaneously. The Volcae doctrine for ambushes was established and effective. You collapsed toward your heaviest armor, laid down suppression fire in the direction of the ambush, and called in air support. Oreth's soldiers began executing this doctrine immediately. They were well-trained soldiers, and they did everything correctly. It did not help, because Danny had positioned his squad not at the points the Volcae doctrine expected, but at the points that the doctrine created when it tried to respond. He had not set an ambush. He had set a consequence. Every correct response the Volcae made under their training moved them toward a worse position. Every soldier who ran for cover ran toward a pre-sighted firing line. Every armored unit that pushed forward pushed into a channel that narrowed until it was a box. Nina Cross was running across the ridge to the east, moving between positions with a speed that her body did not feel entitled to produce, but produced anyway, because adrenaline was a deeply useful substance, and Nina had spent years learning how to use it rather than be used by it. She dropped into a low position behind a rock shelf, sighted down the ridge, and began calling corrections into the squad channel for the fire teams she could see from her angle. Alpha Team, shift left 4 meters. You have 2 coming up the drainage channel. She heard the crack of Alpha Team shifting. 2 shots, silence from the channel. Confirmed, Alpha Team leader said. Oreth was calling for his air support now. 3 Volcae gunships began their descent through the clouds, heat trails cutting white lines toward the battle below. Danny looked at the incoming gunships. He looked at Nina. She was already raising the targeting designator. Earth's air defense network had been tracking those gunships since they broke atmosphere. The targeting designator was not calling in a strike. It was confirming one that was already in progress. The 3 gunships had 4 seconds of flight time remaining. They used all 4 of them. The explosions lit the underside of the clouds orange. Burning debris scattered across 2 kilometers of Icelandic hillside, and the sound arrived 3 seconds later like a closing door. Oreth stood in the clearing, surrounded by fewer soldiers than he had started with, facing a forest that was perfectly quiet again. His communications relay connected to the fleet above. He made his report in objective tactical language, the way an experienced commander is trained to do. The officer on the fleet relay was silent for a long time after Oreth finished. "How many humans engaged your unit?" the officer asked. 8 confirmed, Oreth said, possibly 12. Another silence. "Your unit strength was 40 soldiers, 4 armored units, and 3 air support craft." "Yes," Oreth said. The silence this time lasted long enough that Oreth checked the channel to make sure it was still open. It was open. The officer on the other end was just having difficulty with the math. Danny Cole was already 2 kilometers away, moving his squad to the next position. They had 17 other landing sites to cover, and approximately 90 minutes before the next wave came down. He assigned sectors, checked ammunition, looked at his squad's faces one by one. They were dirty and breathing hard and exactly as focused as they had been at the start. "Good work," he said. "Move." They moved. Commander Zeth requested a full intelligence briefing on humans after the first hour of engagement. What he received changed the temperature in his command chamber. The analyst delivered the briefing in the clipped, efficient tone that Volkai officers are trained to use, and the tone made the content worse rather than better, because it suggested that what was being described was a normal set of facts rather than the most alarming collection of data Zeth had ever heard in 40 years of service. Humans had been conducting organized warfare against each other for approximately 10,000 years. Not small-scale territorial conflicts, organized, strategic, industrial-scale warfare. They had developed specialized weapons, specialized tactics, specialized psychology, specialized medicine to undo the damage their weapons caused so they could send their soldiers back to fight again. They had fought wars that ended only to be followed by larger wars. They had fought wars that covered every continent on their planet simultaneously. And then, having fought all of that, they had chosen to stop fighting each other. Zeth processed this carefully. A species that had learned everything there was to know about war against itself, and then pointed outward. What is their current military readiness level? He asked. Standing forces of approximately 12 million active personnel, the analyst said. 300,000 vessels of varying class, of which roughly 40,000 are designated combat ships. And what was their readiness level before our arrival? Unchanged, Commander. This is their peacetime configuration. Zeth sat with that for a moment. Peacetime, 40,000 combat ships, 12 million soldiers in standing service. The Volkai had achieved dominance over the known galaxy with a fleet of 60,000 vessels, built over 2 centuries, fielded by a species with 300 years of spacefaring history. Humans had been in space for less than 200 years. Pull up their engagement records from the opening contact, Zeth said. The display populated with battle data from the last 90 minutes. Admiral Holt's 14-vessel response force had arrived at the engagement zone 6 minutes ago and was now engaged with Zeth's fleet at close range. The human fleet had arrived in a formation that Zeth's tactical computers had spent 4 minutes trying to classify before returning an error, because the formation did not exist in any tactical database the Volkai possessed. It did not exist because no species had ever attempted it. The approach angle created overlapping fire arcs that were geometrically impossible to cover from the Volkai fleet's current orientation without either breaking formation or accepting an undefended flank. Zeth's fleet was currently doing both, which was worse than choosing one. They invented a new formation, his tactical officer said, and the disbelief in the officer's voice was the most unprofessional thing Zeth had heard in years. He did not correct it, because he was feeling the same thing. Clara West had developed the formation in 48 hours. She had started with a standard pincer approach and pulled it apart, looking at what the Volkai response to a pincer would be, and then designed the approach that the Volkai response had no answer for. She had run it through simulation 600 times in the day and a half since first contact was confirmed. She had found the failure conditions and eliminated them. She had briefed Admiral Holt at midnight, and he had looked at the display for 30 seconds and said, "Do it." Now she was sitting in the tactical chair of the cruiser Endeavour, watching the formation execute, watching the Volkai fleet's cohesion crack down the middle as Holt's force pushed into the gap she had calculated. Corvette Group, increase approach vector by 8 degrees, she said into the fleet channel. You're drifting off the coverage arc. The Corvette Group adjusted, the gap held. Admiral George Holt stood behind her and watched the Volkai formation fragment in real time. He was 61 years old and had 34 years of fleet command behind him, and he had never seen a fleet of this size come apart this cleanly. He had expected a harder fight. He was not complaining. He was, with a small part of his mind, thinking about what this meant going forward, because a man who had spent 34 years in command did not stop calculating. They're pulling their right flank back, Clara said. They're going to try to reform behind their heaviest ships. Let them, Holt said. That puts their heavies between us and their carrier group. Clara looked at him. Give the carrier group a clear run at us, he said. Let them think they have an opening. She understood. You want them committed before we close the door. I want every one of their carriers inside weapons range before they realize there is no door. Clara turned back to her display. She ran the geometry in her head and found that it worked. But only with a timing margin of about 40 seconds, which meant the Corvette group needed to be somewhere it currently was not. I need the Corvettes repositioned, she said, sending coordinates now. The Corvettes were already moving before she finished speaking, because the Corvette captains had been watching the same display, and 2 of them had done the same calculation she had. That was the thing about fighting alongside humans. They thought ahead, individually, simultaneously, in parallel, and they did not need to be told when to start. Zeth watched his carrier group advance into what had looked, for approximately 90 seconds, like a genuine opportunity. Then the human fleet sealed behind his carriers like a hand closing, and Zeth understood that the opportunity had been a designed invitation. He had been led into position. By the time his carrier captains recognized the trap, the human ships were already inside minimum safe range for the carrier's main weapons, too close to fire without hitting each other. The human ships did not have this problem, because they had positioned themselves with exactly the spacing required to fire freely in the enclosed formation. Clara West said, "Admiral, we have a clean solution on all 7 carriers." Holt said, "Fire." The carrier group was gone in 4 minutes. Zeth stood on his command platform and looked at the space where 7 of his most powerful vessels had been, and the number of conclusions available to him had narrowed to 1. He opened a channel to the fleet. All ships withdraw to position Delta, maintain formation. It was the first withdrawal order Zeth had ever given in his career. He gave it without hesitation, because the career that had brought him to this moment was built on one principle above all others. You did not let pride decide your tactics. You looked at what was in front of you, and you responded to what was actually there. What was actually there was a human fleet that had destroyed his carrier group in 4 minutes, using a formation that had not existed 48 hours ago. He needed to send a message to the Volkai High Council immediately, not the standard after-action report, something using the priority channel reserved for emergencies. He needed to tell them that the intelligence reports about humans were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Catastrophically, irreversibly, dangerously wrong. The message from Zeth reached the Volkai High Council in 6 hours. It reached the other 7 members of the Galactic Expansion Coalition in 10. By the time the coalition held its emergency session, 3 of the 7 member species had already begun requesting clarification on their treaty obligations, which was the diplomatic way of asking whether they were actually required to fight. The Sarathi sent their fastest ship. The Drun recalled their fleet from the outer expansion zones. The Karath, who had fought beside the Volkai in every campaign for 60 years, asked for a detailed breakdown of human casualty ratios before committing additional forces. Zeth provided the breakdown. He sent it without comment. The Karath did not respond for 8 hours. When they did respond, they requested a direct communications channel to the human government. Meanwhile, General Aaron Price was looking at a tactical display that covered the entire solar system, from the outer Kuiper belt to the orbital stations above Earth, identifying which of the 17 gaps in Earth's current defensive coverage would look most attractive to an enemy force trying to find a weakness. He found 4. He closed 3 of them with repositioned defense platforms and existing fleet assets. He left the 4th open. The open gap was on the ecliptic plane between Jupiter's 4th and 5th moons. It was the gap that Price would have used if he were the enemy. Good approach angle, natural sensor interference from Jupiter's magnetic field, clear run to the inner system if you got through. He left it open because he had put Lieutenant Commander Owen Drake and a 6-ship rapid response group behind it, sitting silent and cold, every non-essential system powered down to reduce their heat signature to background noise. They had been sitting there for 11 hours. Owen Drake was the kind of officer who could sit in a cold ship for 11 hours and still be sharp when the moment came. Price knew this because he had checked the service record. Drake had once held a defensive position for 72 hours in a training exercise designed to break psychological endurance, and when the exercise ended, his after-action report had been 6 pages of tactical observations and 0 complaints. Price had requested Drake specifically. Command had agreed without discussion. The Drun fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system 14 hours after the Volkai withdrawal. The Drun were not like the Volkai. The Volkai fought with precision and formation. The Drun fought with mass and pressure. They had 80 ships, and those 80 ships moved as a block, dense and overlapping, a wall of firepower that had never failed to break a defensive line simply by the weight of it. They pushed toward the inner system on the most direct route, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having needed to do anything differently. They did not know about the open gap. They did not know that the direct route they had chosen passed within 40,000 kilometers of Jupiter's fourth moon, which was exactly the approach Price had planned for, which was exactly where Owen Drake's 6 ships were waiting. Owen watched the Drun fleet come in on his passive sensors. 80 ships. His 6 were positioned to strike at the formation's command vessels, which the Drun clustered at the center of their block, rather than protecting at the rear the way most fleets did. It was a cultural thing, one of Earth's analysts had noted in the intelligence brief. The Drun believed their commanders should be surrounded by their forces, not sheltered behind them. Owen believed this was a mistake. He waited until the Drun formation was fully committed into the gap before he powered up. 6 ships against 80 was not a battle, it was a statement. The statement was, "We know where your commanders are, and you have just discovered that we were already here." Owen's first volley went precisely into the center of the Drun block. The Drun formation broke, not in the practiced tactical way that a planned retreat looks. It broke in the sudden disordered way that happens when the command structure collapses mid-movement, and the outer ships suddenly have no one to listen to. 80 ships scattered into smaller groups, each group trying to reform under a secondary command structure, none of them moving in coordination with the others. Price was watching from the command center. He gave the Drun exactly 90 seconds to scatter before he sent in the main force. Admiral Holt's fleet hit the fragmented Drun formation from above the ecliptic, and Clara West's targeting solutions were already distributed to every ship before the engagement opened. The fight lasted 22 minutes. The Drun survivors, 31 ships, withdrew past the heliopause and did not come back. In the coalition emergency session, the Kareth ambassador was silent for a very long time. Then she said, "We need to discuss what we are doing." The Volkai representative said, "We are fulfilling our expansion mandate." The Kareth ambassador said, "Against what?" No one answered. The Sarathi representative, a careful and experienced diplomat named Lyra, pulled up the engagement data from both battles and shared it with the full coalition. She did not comment on it. She let the numbers speak. 43 Volkai vessels engaged by 1 human ship, followed by 14. Volkai carrier group destroyed. Volkai fleet withdrawn. 80 Drun vessels engaged by 6 human ships and a responding fleet. Drun formation broken in 90 seconds. 22-minute engagement. Drun force reduced by 60%. The coalition had never lost 2 major engagements in 24 hours. In the entire recorded history of the coalition's expansion campaigns, across 47 civilizations encountered and absorbed, Nothing in their records described what the data in front of them showed. "I am requesting a communications channel to the human government," Lyra said, "before we send anyone else." The Volkai representative said the coalition did not negotiate from a position of retreat. Lyra said, "Then perhaps we should not retreat." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own answer. The Kareth ambassador voted with Lyra. The Sarathi voted with Lyra. The Drun representative, whose fleet was currently limping back from the edge of the human solar system, voted with Lyra. 4 of 7. The communications channel to the human government was opened at 3:40 Earth Standard Time. And General Aaron Price was notified immediately. He looked at the notification for 10 seconds. Then he called Owen Drake. "They want to talk," he said. Owen Drake, who had been awake for 31 hours, said, "Tell them we'll decide what we're talking about." Price allowed himself a very small smile. "I'll pass that along," he said. Ambassador Lyra had spent 40 years in coalition diplomacy, and in 40 years she had never opened a communication channel, not knowing what the other side was going to say. She knew what every species said, because every species said the same thing when the coalition reached out after a military engagement. They said, "We surrender, we submit, we accept your terms." They said it quickly or they said it slowly, but they all said it because the alternative was more engagement with the coalition's military, and no species in the known galaxy wanted that. She opened the channel to the human government. The response was, "Thank you for reaching out. We would like to discuss the terms of your withdrawal from our solar system." Lyra read it 3 times. She had sent a message about opening negotiations for human surrender, and the humans had responded with terms for Volkai withdrawal. She sent a clarification. The humans clarified back. They were not offering to negotiate their surrender. They were offering to negotiate the coalitions. This was not something Lyra had a protocol for. She escalated to the full coalition session. The session convened with 4 factions openly uncomfortable, and the Volkai representative insisting the human response was a bluff, a posture, a primitive intimidation tactic that collapsed on contact with real force. The Kareth ambassador asked how much real force had been applied so far. The Volkai representative did not answer. General Aaron Price was not in the diplomatic session. He was in the command center, watching the 3 remaining Volkai heavy cruisers that had not joined the withdrawal, currently holding position at the edge of the outer system. They had been there for 9 hours. They were not withdrawing and they were not advancing. They were waiting. Price did not like waiting enemies. Waiting meant calculating. Calculating meant something was being prepared. He sent Owen Drake's group to discourage the calculation. Owen brought his 6 ships in slow and obvious, no attempt at concealment, crossing the distance between Jupiter and the outer system with every sensor broadcasting clearly. He wanted them seen. He wanted them to know he was coming while he was still far enough away that they had to decide what to do about it. The Volkai cruisers held position. Owen came in closer. Still they held. He brought his ships to a stop at a distance the Volkai weapons could not quite reach, close enough that his own weapons had a clean solution, and he opened a direct hailing channel. The channel opened after a pause. The Volkai cruiser commander's image appeared, older than Zeth, with a long service record written in the set of his jaw, and the way he looked at the screen like a man who had been looked at by enemies for most of his life. Owen said, "You're staying." The commander said, "This system is claimed territory." Owen said, "When did you claim it?" The coalition expansion mandate covers all systems within the outer arm boundaries. Your solar system falls within those boundaries. Owen leaned forward slightly. That mandate was applied without our consent, by people who did not know we existed or decided it did not matter if we did. We exist. It matters. The commander was quiet. "I'm giving you the same option we gave Zeth," Owen said. "Leave. Take your ships, take your crews, go back to wherever the High Council is sitting and tell them what you found here. Tell them accurately." "And if we don't," Owen said, "then you will not be leaving." It was not a threat. Threats are emotional. It was an assessment delivered flatly from a man who had run the calculations and knew exactly what his 6 ships could do to 3 heavy cruisers at this range and this angle, and had simply communicated the outcome. The Volkai commander looked at him for a long time. Then the 3 cruisers turned and began moving outward. Price watched them go. He watched until they cleared the heliopause. He watched until their signatures faded from the long-range sensors. Then he sat down for the first time in 14 hours and drank a cup of coffee that had been cold for most of those hours. Clara West arrived in the command center 11 minutes later with a fresh tactical summary and a second cup that was actually hot. "Lyra has requested a formal in-person meeting," she said. "She wants to send a shuttle to Earth." "Let her come," Price said. Lyra arrived at Earth's orbital station 2 days later on a small, unarmed shuttle, accompanied by a single aide and no security detail, which was itself a kind of message. She walked through the docking corridor, and the humans who met her were courteous and calm, and she noticed that none of them seemed to be performing the calm. It was not the calm of a species suppressing something. It was the calm of a species that had already worked out what it thought and was comfortable with it. She was taken to a conference room with windows that looked down at the blue and white surface of Earth, and she sat across a table from General Price and Admiral Holt and Owen Drake, who had finally slept and showed it. She had prepared remarks. She had prepared them for 6 hours. She had drafted and discarded 4 different opening positions, trying to find the angle from which the coalition situation looked better than it was. She had not found one. She delivered the opening she had prepared anyway, because it was her job, and then she waited. Price said, "We appreciate the coalition reaching out. Here is what we need from this conversation." He slid a document across the table. Lyra read it. She read it again. It was not a list of demands for reparations. It was not a list of territorial claims. It was not a victory document dressed in diplomatic language. It was a set of conditions for peaceful coexistence, clearly written, specific, each condition tied to a concrete action, an end to the expansion mandate in systems with confirmed sentient life, a framework for first contact protocols that required consent before approach, an independent review body with coalition and non-coalition members, a standing communication channel between species for the purpose of resolving disputes without engagement. It was the document of a species that was not interested in revenge. It was the document of a species that was interested in the future. Lyra set it down and looked at Price. "You're not demanding territory," she said. "We have territory," Price said. "We're demanding respect." She looked at Holt, who was watching her with a level patience that she associated with people who had spent a long time being right and learned not to enjoy it too much. She looked at Owen Drake, who was looking at the window and the earth below it with an expression she could not quite read, something between attachment and responsibility. "The Volkai will push back against several of these conditions," she said. "Then the Volkai will need to decide what they value more," Price said, "the conditions or another engagement." She picked up the document and read it a third time. "I will bring this to the coalition session," she said. "I cannot guarantee the outcome." "We're not asking you to guarantee the outcome," Holt said. "We're asking you to make the case accurately. Tell them what you saw. Tell them what happened at Jupiter. Tell them about the drone. And then show them this document and tell them what it took for us to write terms this reasonable after what your coalition did." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "It is very reasonable," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite professional. "I did not expect that." Price said, "We know." Owen Drake looked away from the window. "We've spent 10,000 years learning what war costs," he said. "We know better than anyone what it takes to end one. We would rather start there." Lyra took the document. She stood. She looked at the three humans across the table, and she thought that 40 years of diplomacy had not prepared her for this specific moment, and she was glad, in some way she would have difficulty explaining later, that she had lived to reach it. She left for the coalition session. She made the case. The conditions were accepted, with minor language adjustments, in 72 hours. Across the outer arm, in 37 inhabited systems, ships that had spent decades under coalition expansion pressure received the new framework through diplomatic channels. There was no celebration. There was, in most places, simply a quiet and unfamiliar sense that something had shifted permanently. On Earth, it was a Tuesday. Owen Drake slept for 14 hours when he woke up. He filed his after-action report, requested leave, and called his sister, who had been watching the news for 3 days straight and had a great many questions. He answered most of them. Some things, he told her, were still being worked out. But the important part was done.